Well, that's good news. And then I'm going to start this. He said, with much optimism. Didn't do right. Because I didn't do the obvious. There we go. There we go. And I'm going to hide you guys. All right. We started last week with some arguments for God. And
Oh, wait. Before you get into it, can I ask a question about the sermon last week and get your perspective on it?
sure.
Because I asked Kevin on the way home last week and he didn't know either.
You know what? Reason tells me I have a feeling I probably want to stop recording right now.
Oh, no. Am I going to get you in trouble?
No, I'm just pause. Yes, ma'am. We're back. All right. So we've been talking about the traditional arguments for theism. Last week we did the ontological argument, which, if you recall, was argues for the existence of God from the very concept of God. And it's a very unsatisfactory sort of thing. Nancy was going, I just can't buy it. And I said, you're not alone. I have a hard time with it. But it turns out it's actually, there are people that say, no, it's legit. But I'm just going, well, then the perfect pizza. I don't know. Anyway, then that's what we did last week, St. Anselm's. The cosmological argument, it's going to take a long time for it to go through. But that's, if something has a beginning, it has a cause. And that cause has got to be God for the universe. And the teleological argument is the design that's so evident in our universe. The fine tuning that you're going to hear on the physical side. It's just, everything points to, this is the watchmaker thing. If you're walking on the beach and you find a watch, you go, that's not a natural phenomenon. Somebody made that and it fell out of his pocket. And that's kind of this argument. But what we're going to talk about today is the moral argument. It's the shared moral values of the world point to a source of these values. That is embodiment of the good, God. We all know that there are exceptions, but there's a shared set of values. You don't kill somebody for no reason. You don't take what's not yours. These sorts of things. And here's the argument. One, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. It's kind of, it's the negative of how I would have expressed it. My problem with this, and this is what gave rise to my work this week, was that's William Lane Craig's argument. He's a Christian, and he finds that convincing. And turns out, and so I asked, well, do the others agree? So I pulled out my old introduction to philosophy book, and I spent the week on this. And that's where we are today. So we're going to go through, and it's not going to, we aren't going to finish this today. Socrates, 470, 399. Here is my, you've seen these before, right? My chronological charts. And let's do the earlier one. So this is Egypt. This is Israel. This is various other entities, including Greece. And then over here are Assyria and Babylon. And this turns out to be the Persians on this particular sheet. And Socrates was born down here. And he extends to here. What's going on in the world at this point? Well, this is the Persian period. This is before Ezra and Nehemiah. So it's after Zechariah, because they've rebuilt the temple, the little thing that it is. Greece has not reached world power status yet. Alexander is 100 years away. So we're in the middle of the Persians running everything. Xerxes the first, for example. And what's interesting is this time period, this is when Confucius lives, and it's when Buddha lives. So you got Socrates, Confucius, and Buddha all at the same time. I find that intriguing. Traditional dates of Buddha are much earlier, 800, or we don't even know. But it looks like it's actually more like this. And Confucius is certainly here. And so you have these, what is God doing? There's these thought processes going on around the world, including Socrates. So Socrates' big thing is, what's the good life? And that ultimately is what all philosophies are asking. What is the good life? And how ought humans to live? And humans ought to live, so it's achieved a good life. That makes sense. Okay. This is Proverbs, by the way. Proverbs is answering this question. What is the good life? How to do it. They're going to have a lot about Yahweh in there. And Job and Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs are also asking these types of questions. But Socrates, his big thing was, remember, I know I don't know. That makes me the smartest man. And he didn't mean that egotistically. He just goes, I know I don't know. You guys seem to think you know. And so he spent his life, he would engage. Oh, you know, good. Let's talk, because I want some answers. And they would talk, and he'd ask questions, you'd ask questions. And so it turns out you really don't know anything, do you? Oops. The good life can be discovered if and only if men have knowledge, is what Socrates' conclusion was. Now, there's a couple of things that's not expressed here. Who can tell me what are some assumptions in this, as I phrased it, that haven't been asked? Well, what is good?
What is good?
Exactly. What is good? And what is knowledge? How do we know? These are questions they actually have to answer. Back to the moral argument. If there's no God, then how do we define good? Now, Socrates is a Greek in the classical period, so he believes in gods. All right, so they're there. It's not quite the same. If a person knows what is good, they'll act in such a way as to try to achieve it. And I didn't mean to write knows twice. Knows is an attack because that. How do we define know and how do we define good? There's a whole field of philosophy called epistemology. How do we know anything? And how do we know that we know it? It's there, but notice he's making assumptions. Plato, his student. Plato studied under Socrates. Not a bad gig, okay? He's a little later. Do you remember the Platonic ideals? And Plato had this thing that there were forms. There's an ideal table somewhere. And all tables that we see on the world are merely particular instances of that ideal table. And his point being there's an absolute table. See where I'm going with that? So there's a absolute good. Because remember our whole, which tells me he acknowledges that the very question. If you don't have God, how do you define good? There's no absolutes. It's all relative. But he is. He believes in God, but it's Greek. It's a little weird. But he handles it like goodness is a form. There is, in fact, an absolute good. Now, how do you know that? You apprehend it by reason. Okay. What does that mean? Frankly, what does that mean? He would teach. You can learn what good is or whatever the goal is, just like you would do science. how you can figure out how the planets are going to move. Watch and take notes. And when you figure out what region it is, you have knowledge. Well, that's a little circular in case you haven't noticed. And he actually means you apprehend it by being raised and educated to lead good lives. But we're back to what is good. But essentially, you raise up Bryce to lead a good life, and he will apprehend what good is because he's been steeped in it from birth. That's the idea. That has to be done by people who have already gone through that process and know what the good is. But defining it, not so easy. Okay, it's the appeal to the absolute confirms. Remember, all this survey is trying to do is William Lane Craig right. If you don't have absolute, is it all just made up? Well, so far it seems to be, yeah. And here's the ways of trying to get around those absolutes. Nothing's defined. That's the problem. Two assumptions Plato had. If one knows what is right or good, and in any particular circumstance, one will never act immorally in the circumstance. He actually thought that. So he's making a distinction between what is good and acting good, if you will, what is good and what is right. All right. And consequently, moral rules are objective because we're going after an objective. In my assessment, no, it's not, because I can't find it. Well, what do I know? And by the way, that's not, remember, I was reading a book that was taking me through these guys, and that was the critics of Plato said, no, it's not. You're wrong. Aristotle. Socrates trained Plato, Plato trained Aristotle. You remember that? By the way, who's Aristotle's most famous student? You know this. Alexander the Great. Philip of Macedon was king of the Macedonians, which is north of Greece, Bulgaria today, came down, conquered him. And then Philip said, hired Aristotle, train my son Alexander, who ended up conquering the world when he was 30, you know. So having Aristotle as a tutor, not too bad, I don't think. He outlived Alexander. Alexander died in 323. But anyway, Aristotle, trained by Plato, has a reaction to Plato. So Plato has these ideal forms, okay? Aristotle says, I disagree. BS. And it's empirical. You can look at the world and make deductions. Have you ever seen I think it's in the Vatican, Raphael's painting of Aristotle and Plato are walking side by side, and Plato's doing this, talking about his ideals, and Aristotle's doing this, pointing at the earth, saying, no, we had it. Aristotle did a lot of observations. I mean, he freaking stared at nature and worked at it. He was very, very, very sharp. What is a good life? It's a good life. It's a life of happiness. That's the beginning of hedonism. And hedonism not in the let's go eat, drink, and be merry, but the point of life is to be happy, certainly not to be sad. So, and happiness is an activity of the soul in accord with perfect virtue. Okay, well, what's the unspoken assumption? Virtue. What's virtue? Oh, how should one live? One ought to live in moderation. He's the origin of he didn't call it the golden mean. He just called it the mean, but we call it the mean. Everything in moderation. That's Aristotle's view of the good life. You avoid the extremes. Just moderation. This gives rise to hedonism. But let me back up. So what's the problem with this? You still don't define things. And one of the arguments was, not everybody can live in moderation. You know, an artist is going to be pretty extreme. You know, that's not moderation to go spend the time up here making a backdrop for the church. And that was one of the huge, Bertrand Russell was one that really hammered this. Not everybody can live like that. It's rather smug on Aristotle's part. And in fact, Bertrand Russell concluded, I don't think he knows what a friend is. Because moderation, no, when your friend dies, you grieve. And he would say, no, moderation. Are you nuts? Right. So, this gave rise to hedonism, this idea of pleasure. And it's two guys, Aristippus and Epicurus, believe it or not Epicurus, it's Epicurus. 89. They lived, they may be hedonists, but they lived a long freaking time. This especially living where they lived, the time frame. So he's a contemporary of Socrates, Aristippus is, and Epicurus is one of Aristotle. So it's from the Greek word for pleasure, heidoe. And the only good is the present pleasure. Past doesn't do us any good. And the future is not actualized yet. So it's the present pleasure. And he was kind of an ascetic. He's not saying get drunk, have sex with everything that moves. But he's saying the things that give pleasure, that's what you want to pursue. Though he didn't outlaw the others. Epicurus lived moderately, but pleasant. So that's the influence of Aristotle, his contemporary on it. So we want to pleasantly. And the real big thing is they got to what is good. And what they ended up saying was good is what doesn't cause pain. You know, you don't want pain. And this, for example, sex. And it's just wanting sex is going to cause pain. And so is that really a good? And that came up with discussions about, well, is there anything that doesn't cause pain? So then some end up settling on the net difference. The difference between the good and the pain, if that's a positive value, then that's a good. Okay. And you know what an Epicurean is? That's somebody, you know, gourmand and all this. And a hedonist, it gives rise to this stuff eventually.
So I think I've asked you this before, but aren't the Epicureans the ones that used to eat and go up to go eat again?
That's the Romans that did that. But yeah, the Epicureans wouldn't.
So remember the place used to do the restaurant?
Molly's?
Yeah, you remember they had the Epicureans delight?
Well, it was called a Bacchus feast.
Maybe it wasn't.
And Bacchus is not moderation.
Yeah,
It's the
well,
Greek god of excess. But yeah, that's, your point's taken. And eat, drink, and be merry. Remember, by the way, Paul says something akin to this. He says, look, if Jesus isn't resurrected, I would be a hedonist. He doesn't say it that way. He says, but why wouldn't you just eat, drink, and be merry? All right. So this is Epicurean stuff, dominated philosophy after Aristotle for a long time. The other thing is, in the discussions about if there's a God or not, I think you end up here. If there's no God in your life, has no significance, why wouldn't you just seek pleasure? That's actually where this is coming from. You know, if you're going to die, why not get pleasure for the time that you have? And this, people can't live with the idea, now they're not there yet that the world is finite and all that. They assume it's going to go on forever. But, you know, we're in a different era and people fall back to this because you can't live with no hope. So, all right. Cynicism and Stoicism grew out of this. Boy, we're going faster than I ever would have thought we would have. Greece is collapsing at the time these guys come up, and these are philosophies trying to help you deal with this, akin to what we're in now, right now, except there's political collapse to go with it. I mean, we at least still have a state, for good or for ill. Diogenes also died at 89. I love how these guys live so long. He's famous for, I'm looking for a man, a true man. He held the lantern and he wandered. I'm looking for a true man. He grew out of hedonism and then rejected it. The pleasure, no. And Diogenes was an extreme ascetic. Didn't bathe, didn't have a house, wore the same cloak, rotting and falling off of it. And the whole point is it's actually kind of a Taoist approach to life, the Tao, Oriental philosophy. Taoism in a nutshell is you can't change the world, so quit beating your head against the wall. Just go with the flow. Maintain your character or whatever. But no, don't keep running into the wall. That's stupid. And that's essentially what he was saying. You got to remove yourself from what the world can do to you as much as you can. So if you don't, get rid of the house, then they can't take it from you. You see what I'm saying? That sort of stuff. And you try not to be affected by this stuff. Stoicism grew out of cynicism. It's a later form of it. And as I put it, it's cynicism light. They tend not to be the extreme ascetics that the cynics were, but it's still the same thing. Avoid worldly pleasures. But this is how Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor, an emperor, mind you, can be a Stoic because he can have whatever he wants. But the whole point is, how do I deal with a world that's unpredictable, that's collapsing around me, where kids are shot in elementary school, that my neighbor's kids decided he's no longer a boy, he wants to be a girl. That sort of stuff. How do you do it? And they're step back from it so it doesn't affect you. Withdraw from it. Here's some problems. Ultimately, it's deterministic. The Stoics believe that everything in life is predetermined. And it's not quite clear how. Is it the gods? Is it a function of nature? And they tend to blur together nature and God with them. So there's no free will. And yet the whole thing is make a choice of not letting things affect you. But if it's determination, I don't have a choice in my choice. How can I choose? And that's a big deal. Now we're jumping up ahead. Stoicism dominates up through 1,000 years. It dominates the world, philosophically speaking. And if you've never read Marcus Aurelius, I recommend you do. It's interesting. You're not going to do it, but he's got some insights. And you go, okay. I mean, even a drunk squirrel finds an acorn once in a while. Isn't that the way it works?
Squirrel finds a nut every now and then.
Mine's drunk, yours blind. And so now we're in the 1600s. Baruch Spinoza is a Jew in Amsterdam. And is that Holland? I've only been there 5 times.
It's the Netherlands.
Netherlands.
Yeah, which is Holland.
Are they the same thing?
They're-
What's the other country around there that's not? Denmark is something else.
Yeah, we just actually had this whole conversation this week because we just booked
Where are y'all going?
the Netherlands
Yeah.
and Switzerland, Germany.
Oh, well, when I came back from Ukraine, I'd spend the night in Amsterdam to unwind, and it's great. And I would do it in the red light district because there's something happening.
We probably won't do it.
Well, but you don't have to go to the prostitutes, but you can get French fries with mayonnaise. So anyway, Baruch Spinoza, he's a pantheist. I won't, everything's God is everything sort of thing. But he's a Jew who rejected Judaism. He dies at 44, you notice. Here's a statement by Baruch Spinoza. Nothing regarded in its own nature can be called perfect or imperfect, especially when we are aware that all things which come to pass according to the eternal order and fixed laws of nature. This is determinism. Here he's attributing it to nature because we're now in the 1600s. He doesn't think there's a God. Or if it is, it's an impersonal God. He created the world, that was about it. This is deterministic. no free will. Everything unfolds according to the plan. And if you're going to have an impersonal God, back to our moral argument, this is what you're left with. Another quote from him. The terms good and evil are only applied relatively, so that the same thing may be called good or bad according to the relations in view. And we can see where that would be true at times, but what does it reveal? He's a relativist. There are no absolutes. So William Lane Craig wasn't making this stuff up. This is what happens. They end up like this. And I was just going, huh. Because I wasn't sure. It made sense when Craig said it, but did they actually say it? Yeah. And the book I'm reading is just letting them have it. Yeah, just flat out relative. It's kind of a Taoist view, like I said, about the hedonists. If you can't change things, then just adapt. The analogy is don't beat your head against the wall. That's just, you're not going to remove the wall that way. That's Spinoza's view. Just figure out what's going on and live with it. This gave rise to something called utilitarianism in the 1700s. John Stuart Mill, you've certainly heard of, and Jeremy Bentham. It's utilitarian because the greatest good for the greatest number is the goal. They don't define good, but that's what they mean. I mean, it's kind of intuited good, but we're back to the same. They don't define it. If pleasure, now Stuart Mill reacted to Bentham and said, well, you got to see the better goods, not just any good, but the better goods. Well, how can they be ranked? Unless, and this is not my thought, this is the authors of my book in 1972, there must be some standard beyond pleasure to rank them. If you can say this pleasure is better than that pleasure, you got to be comparing it to something else. There's a standard that you're using. Where's that standard come from? And people sneak in these standards when you're talking about it. Immanuel Kant, you've certainly heard of. God, when I was reading about this, he is a Prussian. Your duty, virtue is fulfilling your duty. Prussians, as in World War I Germans, fulfill your duty. It was disturbing to read it. The good is doing your duty, but being moral is why do you do your duty? To avoid being punished? That's not good. That's not moral. You do your duty because it's your duty. An action is morally right, and he adds this. This is what's called a categorical imperative, if you ever hear this. How do we determine if something's right besides doing your duty? Well, if it's something that you would like to be seen as a universal rule, that's it. An action is morally right if one can will that it become a universal law, which all should follow. Otherwise, it's wrong. And you can go where you can figure out where the reactions will be, but act so it's, and then he adds something to it. Act so it's to treat humanity, whether in your own person or in somebody else, as an end, not as a means. So be kind to one another in essence. And you go, all right. I'll go back. Now you want to be universal law? No. Thou shalt not lie. No, some universal. No, really? Remember Carlton, Tim Boom. What was our first name? Corey Ten Boom. You know, the Jews are hidden under the floor. And she's, no, there's nobody there. There's just yeah, they're down there. What are you doing? We can't lie. So this doesn't work. But this gives rise to German culture, by the way. It's pretty interesting. And now the new guys, now we're in the modern era. He died a year after I was born. G.E. Moore. How do you define good? Well, it was a long, complicated thing, but essentially he's saying you can't. So he's recognizing what we've been saying. You know, Plato, you're going to intuit it by reason. And he said, no, you can't define good. If you're going to do it in naturalistic terms, then you're not saying anything. You're saying pleasure is pleasure. That's not saying anything. Good is pleasure. Well, you're not saying anything. So it's not possible. And this gets right to something called, that's where we are today, the emotive theory of ethics. This is fascinating. Watch this. All moral judgments are purely emotive. That is, you're either expressing your emotions or trying to elicit such emotions. Shooting is murder. That's just your emotions popping up. Or you're trying to get somebody else to agree with you. Wow. There is no morals, is what he's saying. Consequently, moral standards, moral principles, moral recommendations are always the expression of attitudes and emotions having no objective validity whatsoever. So turns out that William Lane Craig was right. And people recognize this. That, in fact, they aren't doing it in terms of because there's no God, there's no objective. They're just assuming there's no God, and that's their orientation. Therefore, trying to come up with moral values, it's just pure nonsense. And now we're going to develop this argument within Craig next week and see where it takes it. I did not think we'd get through all this. That was a lot. You guys were good. Any questions? You guys sit there just stare at me blankly. Did you understand this? Did you follow it? Yeah, but it was over and over. It was the same question, right? Nobody's defining anything. So how do you live it? And that's what I'm just showing you. That was true from Socrates to the present. Does that make sense? So, all right, we're going to pray now. So I'm going to stop the recording.